Hi, and welcome back. This video should be the last one to finish up the topic that is labeled perceptual constancy, but we're going to shift the topic just a little bit here. Let me try to give some context, and this, of course, is referring back to the first part where I really tried to lay out what perceptual constancy is and why it's a problem. And let me review that for a second. Perceptual constancy is the idea that when we think about that little diagram I have with the tree and the world versus the tree and the mind, constancy refers to the fact that the properties of the tree or any object in the world tend to stay pretty constant. Objects do not typically change in shape and size. Obviously, there are certain kinds of transformations that happen in reality that might cause things to deform in non-rigid ways, but most objects are rigid, and that's really not the point. The point is that we perceive objects more or less correctly, in a sense, right? The idea is that a rigid object that maintains a constant shape and size is perceived as being a rigid object that maintains a constant shape or size. Meanwhile, if it happens to be a non-rigid object, like say clay that somebody is shaping into something, we perceive it, again, correctly as a non-rigid transformation, right? So the issue there is this many-to-many mapping issue, right? If we assume, as we do from the sensation-mediated theory of perception, that the mental representation that we are constructing, whether it's the tree in that diagram or anything else, is based on data from the sensations, what we're seeing here is quite a bit of ambiguity in the sensations, right? We have, in the case of the sensations, a non-rigid transformation of the shape and size of the retinal pattern. And in some cases, that corresponds to an actual non-rigid kind of an event, like somebody shaping some clay. But in other cases, it actually corresponds to a rigid object undergoing some form of a transformation, like a rotation, or in the case of it getting nearer and farther, that's called a translation. And so rigid objects may rotate or translate in space, and that causes a variety of non-rigid geometric transformations of the retinal image that need to be de-ambiguated by perceptual processes so that we can correctly perceive it as a rigid object rotating and translating. And yet we still can also discriminate that from non-rigid objects, which might also undergo similar kinds of non-rigid transformations in the retinal image. This ambiguity of the sensations is the problem, because the problem here is, how do we understand what happens between sensation and perception that manages to correct this input? And I've previously called it a poverty of stimulus argument, right? The idea is that there's simply just not enough information in the sensations to tell us what it is we are looking at, and there's not enough information to discriminate rigid from non-rigid objects, and yet somehow we're able to do it anyway. And that means that there must be some almost nearly miraculous kind of a process happening, but that goes from sensation to perception. And a lot of it has to do with, again, that poverty of stimulus claim that the sensations are meaningless and ambiguous, and they really need a lot of help. And there are no one-to-one mappings. And that's, again, another crucial point. There are no supposed one-to-one mappings between objects and sensations. And if that's the case, we're kind of left with a really big challenge in perceptual science to figure out how the brain manages to see the world correctly And what I want to do now, having reviewed, hopefully well enough, the first part of these notes. And again, this kind of connects back to the entire sensation and perception topic that I have like 3 or 4 different recordings for, right? As well as the first half of the perceptual constancy notes here, and really talking about the same thing. But here we're going to try to transition to something else. We're going to try to find a different solution that challenges the assumption of the poverty of stimulus argument. And it starts with this question right here. Is it possible that there are patterns in light that can inform one, say a perceiving agent, about events and objects in one's surroundings? That's an important little clause there, about events and objects, right? So what I said before about an object that is rigid, but it is also doing something like rotating or translating, that's an object and it's an event. And we can perceive both of those things at the same time, right? We perceive a door opening, and the door is the object, and the opening of the door is a rotation, right? It rotates around the hinges. And so one edge of the door remains fixed, and the other one moves around that fixed central point, and it rotates around a vertical axis, right? So the event is rotation, and the object is a rectangular door. And what we have previously argued was that the retinal image is really ambiguous with regard to what's happening here, and that we have to do some kind of thing to fix it up. But what if we have a different answer to that question right here, right? Is it possible that there are patterns in light that can inform us about objects and events? Now, notice there is another crucial phrase here. Besides objects and events, instead of writing retinal images or sensations, I wrote about patterns in light. So that's really the crucial thing here. What we are suggesting is that we are going to move away from an overt focus on retinal images as the beginning of vision. And instead, we're going to talk about light, patterns in light in particular, as the stimulus for vision. Let's think about that. If we return back, let me go to the beginning of these notes. Actually, I hate to jump around while I'm doing this in Zoom. I want to go to this diagram, sorry. Remember, the distal stimulus in our original diagram was a tree. The proximal stimulation is the retinal image, right? And what I have previously said is that vision scientists and perceptual scientists are interested very much in what happens at the level of proximal stimulation. That is, how does the visual system itself work? And then what are sensations? And that's when we talked a lot about psychophysics. And then what happens to get us from sensation to perception? And that's stuff that's covered in things like the object recognition content in the book, right? But one of the things we have not yet talked about, we said, well, the distal stimulus is something that is not of interest to psychologists because that's just the world. Maybe that's something we'll save for physicists and biologists and chemists and so forth. But psychologists apparently don't seem to be interested in the distal stimulus. But what about that arrow that connects the distal stimulus to proximal stimulation? That's light, in the case of vision anyway, reflecting from the tree to the eye. And again, it seems as if psychologists have historically left that topic to the physicists and not to take it over as part of vision, right? Vision only begins once the receptors become active, apparently. So we're going to change this assumption here. I'm just going to run back to this point where we're supposed to start here. And so if it is possible, let's currently give a tentative yes to as an answer to this question, right? Is it possible that there are patterns in light that can provide information about objects and events? Let's assume maybe yes, right? What that would mean is that there could possibly be a one-to-one mapping between the object and the event, like a door opening and rotating around a vertical axis, and a corresponding pattern in light. Okay? If that was the case, if that was true, again, I'm just going to work on working on a hypothetical at this point. If that is true, then what we could say is that pattern in light could serve as a form of information about the object and the event. And I want you to make sure that you understand that point, because that point's pretty important. Let me say it again. If it is true that there is a pattern in light that corresponds uniquely, aka in a one-to-one fashion, to the object and the event, then that pattern in light could be a source of information about the object and the event. Why is it a source of information? Because the correspondence, the unique correspondence or one-to-one correspondence between the pattern and the light and the object and the event is one-to-one. It is therefore not ambiguous. And if it's not ambiguous, it can truly be informative. It is only the fact that when we have previously been talking about retinal images as being ambiguous, that we struggle to understand how they could possibly be informative about the world. Technically, they cannot be informative about the world. That's why we have to invoke, excuse me, all sorts of internal cognitive processes to fix up and elaborate on that sensory input. But what this would also mean here is that if we claimed that there was information in the light patterns, then that would be information. And then what we would need to do, of course, is to explain how a visual system, which of course would involve eyes, but technically would involve the entirety of a visual system working as a functional whole, right? And let's imagine another situation now where we do have patterns in light, and we're talking about light here. We're not talking about retinal image. We're talking about light reflecting from objects. That is information, and potentially, hypothetically, information. We can now imagine a visual system that entails eyes and brains all working together as a functional whole that is able to detect those patterns in light and use those patterns in light to do things. And that could entail, of course, seeing and recognizing and controlling that organism's movement in the world, because, of course, vision is an important spatial sense that plays this role in navigation, moving around in a cluttered environment. So the next thing to do is to try to move away from the hypothetical, right? And try to see if we can determine that the answer is truly yes, right? Instead of just making it a hypothesis, can we provide evidence that there are, in fact, patterns in the light? If that's the case, we would need to describe what these patterns are. So that's this point, second question here about what kinds of patterns are there. Because in fact, the kinds of patterns that are present would need to be explained and described, because that would correspond to the kinds of things in the world that are perceivable. If there's a pattern in the light about some property of an object, then that property is perceivable. If there is no pattern in the light about some other property of an object, then that property of that object is not perceivable. That seems like a triviality, but it's kind of important, right? Because if I think about the objects having a particular shape and size, then presumably that creates a certain pattern in the light. And if my visual system detects that, I can perceive its shape and size. But if there is another property that the object has, such as its mass or its temperature, and that does not create any pattern in light, then that particular property of the object, which is a real physical property the object has, would not at least be visually perceivable. So that means some properties of objects are not visually perceivable, or I could just shorten that to say visible, right? Because they don't structure light in any meaningful way. But some properties of objects are visible because they do structure the light in a specific way, specific being important here. So we would need to determine what these patterns in the light are so that we can understand what are the visible properties of objects. And then once we have that, we would then need to also do the actual perceptual research with perceiving agents, humans, or any other animal that we might want to study, to determine that they in fact detect those patterns that we have identified, and then also use those patterns for perceiving and acting. So let's take a look here at how this might go. We're going to start, number one, by, again, hypothesizing the existence of informative patterns in light. And if that's the case, that they're going to be informative patterns, then it must be the case that such patterns have this unique correspondence about that which they inform, right? And that's, again, the one-to-one mapping being important here. Not one to many or many to one or many to many. That's where ambiguity comes from. It has to be one-to-one. What are the kinds of patterns? Well, we have to think about what a visible pattern is, right? A visual pattern is one that has a spatial extent. Think about what that means. A spatial extent means it extends in at least one dimension or direction. And of course, typically we think of these patterns as being two-dimensional, because a visible pattern can have a width and a height, but it doesn't really have a depth per se. But at least we can have a spatial extent. So there can be a spatial pattern. But one thing that we also probably just common sense would realize is that patterns change over time. And therefore, they have a temporal extent, right? What is a temporal extent? It means basically a pattern of how that spatial pattern changes over time. There's a pattern to the pattern, if you will, right? And that means if you have a spatial pattern, but that spatial pattern evolves over time in a regular way, then that creates a temporal pattern. And we can put those two things together and call this a spatiotemporal pattern. A pattern of change, a spatial pattern that changes over time. So that means that a spatial pattern could potentially inform about object properties, especially their spatial characteristics like shape and size. And the temporal side of things could inform about the event, such as the rotation, a rotating door, or an object that is approaching you, like someone throws a baseball at you. And you can perceive the object and that it's coming at you. You have a spatial pattern and a temporal pattern, right? And then the third step is to then determine whether or not whatever this visible pattern is that we have identified, the spatiotemporal pattern that we have identified, is this something that a perceiving animal that has a visual system actually detects? And if they can detect it, do they respond to it? That is, do they use it? If I say that there's a visible pattern that corresponds to a ball that has been thrown towards you, then obviously you should be able to use that pattern to catch it, if that's what your goal is, right? Or if you're playing dodgeball, then you do the opposite. You don't catch it, you try to jump out of the way. So we have some jobs to do in perceptual research if we're going to take this approach. We would need to discover what are the perceptible properties of the world, that is, what are the visible properties of an object, determine what the corresponding light patterns would be, the spatiotemporal patterns that provide information about those visible properties, and then determine how a sensory system actually detects and uses those patterns. And it would look this would create a different kind of perceptual theory, right? Instead of the one that I had before that had 4 steps and 3 arrows, right? We don't have a distal object and proximal stimulation and sensations and then perception anymore. We have 3, right? We have objects and events that have their various properties. And then we have these spatiotemporal patterns in light. And we're going to say here that there is a one-to-one mapping. Again, this remains hypothetical until we prove it, but we can at least hypothesize that there's a one-to-one mapping between the object and event and the patterns in light. And that would mean that if we have an informative, unambiguous pattern in the light, that would also result in a particular consistent, unique mapping to perception. And that means that we don't need to have these meaningless sensations in there. Therefore, we don't have what we previously called sensation-mediated perception. Now perception is mediated by light patterns, but those light patterns are informative, and it's not at all like the mediation problem that I previously talked about in the first lecture when I talked about the translator issue. Remember, the translator issue is the one where somebody says something in another language, and you don't know what that means until you have a mediator who comes between to translate, convert it to your language, in which case what you know directly is only what the translator has told you. But in this situation, what we're suggesting is that the mapping from object and event to light is exact and one-to-one and lawful. In fact, I labeled that a natural law. Why did I do that? Because that's physics. And so we would say that there must be certain lawful physical rules that govern how light reflects from an object and an event. And therefore, if that is a lawful physical process, that light reflecting from objects as they undergo various events is just a thing that's part of the natural world, then this, of course, would be a natural law. Then we could add to that perception by claiming that visual systems can detect these spatiotemporal patterns. And that would also essentially be a natural law too. And therefore, the relationship between perception and objects would be lawful. And that would give us a more parsimonious theory of perception, right? Simpler, fewer assumptions, fewer stages, and one that does not raise any concerns about skepticism, the way we previously had suggested, right? Here's an example, potentially. Yeah, it's a weak example. One thing that you may have encountered a little bit in the book is the issue of occlusion, right? When one object is partially covered up by another, that is, if you're looking, I said, use the phrase cluttered environment earlier, right? So our environment is full of clutter. There's lots of objects, and some objects are closer to us than other objects, and some of those further objects are partially hidden by the nearer objects, and therefore they are occluded from view. Now, do we have to infer that the hidden object exists? And even if we can see part of it, do we have to infer that the part we cannot see exists? Well, and from certain traditional views in cognitive psychology, the answer to that is yes, we do infer, right? We don't know or perceive the hidden parts of the object. We simply just infer them. And by the way, that's true not just for a partially hidden object, like if there's something partially covered up by another object that's closer, but think about looking at a coffee mug. I don't have my regular coffee mug here. I'm done drinking coffee for the day, but I have a stein that belonged to my grandfather that I just keep for pencils right here. So I'll hold that up to the camera here. Now, there is a backside to it, obviously, and there's more stuff on the backside, right? But now that I've turned it around, and those 3 characters that we're drinking on the other side, are they still there? Obviously, The other half of the mug that you previously saw is still there. There it is, right? And now we're back. Do you have to infer the backside of the mug? Again, according to cognitive psychology, or at least some traditional themes in cognitive psychology, yes. In fact, where does that come from? That comes from, in part, Piaget, if you've had developmental psych. Remember object permanence, if you've had developmental psych? The idea is that young children do not intuitively and inherently understand that objects exist when we cannot see them. And therefore they are surprised and they enjoy peekaboo and so forth. And at some point, once they develop a sufficiently experienced schema of reality, they are then able to understand that objects exist, even when they are not being perceived immediately. But that ability is mediated by the cognitive structure of a schema, right? It is a form of knowledge that drives their understanding of the world and therefore enables them to interact with the world better. It essentially is a form of knowledge that is used to support their perceptual inference that the object exists. But what if we say that there is instead a very specific transformation that occurs? Let's try that again. Hopefully you can see what's happening. Zoom sometimes doesn't capture these little animations very well, but and if this doesn't work, then just download the PowerPoints and put them into, open it up in a slideshow. You can make this happen yourself. You see the little green square passes behind the red square. There is a very specific pattern that occurs here. And it's called not just progressive occlusion, but it's called optical deletion, right? Or deletion of optical elements at a boundary. And this means that as that green object passes behind the red object, there's a transformation that's taking place. There is, in fact, a spatiotemporal pattern. And it is the kind of spatiotemporal pattern that does not tend to be the kind of pattern that would occur if the green square was being destroyed somehow, as if it was dissolving in acid or burning or blowing up or anything like that. The kind of things that might cause it to actually disappear would create a very different visible pattern. The same is true of the Stein, right? As I rotate this and different parts of it come in and out of view, there is a very specific kind of visible pattern that emerges over time, a spatiotemporal pattern that specifies the three-dimensional object rotating, right? So we would say here that this particular simple little visible pattern of progressive occlusion or optical deletion is unique to the spatial relationship between the two objects and the relative position and movement between the two objects. It would not specify going out of existence. But keep in mind, it's also something that involves the perceiver here as well, right? If imagine a situation where, you know, I'm sitting here looking at my computer screen, right? And I can see a little bit of the wall behind it. And if I move my head to the side the way I do it right now, I can make part of my wall come into view, and then part of my wall goes back out of view as I move back up. And that kind of progressive occlusion that's happening there is really about me, as well as this relative location of the side of my computer screen and the wall behind it. It's also about my point of view and my perspective and my movement relative to those things. It's really a relationship between all three spatial points. So I've established essentially a linkage between myself and these objects by moving around. And I've created a pattern of visible light, that spatiotemporal pattern in light that occurs in a very reliable way. So what we're going to do is, as I said, it's one thing to demonstrate that the light pattern exists, but we also need to demonstrate that if that perceptual systems respond to it. So have we done the first job? Have we sufficiently demonstrated that these spatiotemporal patterns in light exist? Well, with the progressive occlusion example, that's, as I said, it's potentially a weak example, but we're going to come back in the next unit and we're going to talk about this approach in a little bit more detail. And there's going to be some other examples related to optic flow and the concept of optic flow and patterns embedded in optic flow that specify a lot of things. And we can work these out in mathematical detail. And we're going to provide a couple of examples of that in that topic once we get to it. And so maybe let's hold the phone on that. But what I want to do next is I want to stick to the kind of broad overview of the next step, right? So after we demonstrate the one-to-one mapping from object and event property to spatiotemporal light patterns, we need to talk about how we do perception research, which is to engage in a perturbation experiment, right? So what is a perturbation experiment? The idea is that if we perturb the spatiotemporal pattern in light, we would expect there to be a corresponding perturbation to perception. Now, for various reasons, this is referred to as the perturbation experiment. And you may also notice in the module, I have added a link to a blog post by Andrew Wilson, who also explains the perturbation experiment. And I recommend that because not only does he do a good job explaining the perturbation experiment, but his explanation very much aligns with the kind of way in which I would explain it, mainly because Andrew went to the same school that I did and graduated with his degree from the same lab that I did. So his approach is going to be 100% consistent with mine. So you read that, and that provides additional, I think, explanation of what the perturbation experiment is. But the funny thing about the perturbation experiment is it's really just a fancy way of talking about simple experimental design, right? We talk about in experimental design, we talk about independent variables and dependent variables. And that is exactly what this is, right? When you perturb the spatiotemporal pattern in light, you're also manipulating it. And therefore, that becomes your independent variable. And then you're going to hope that there should be and determine through experimentation that there would be a corresponding change in the perception, which is your dependent variable. So manipulate the independent variable and observe corresponding changes or systematic changes to your dependent variable. That's what we're talking about here. We're going to manipulate the spatiotemporal light pattern and measure changes in perception. Now, here's an example where the perturbation experiment is clearly, you see why we tend to call it a perturbation experiment, because we're perturbing kind of reality a little bit here for people. So these are the moving room studies that were done by David Lee in Scotland back in the 1970s. And you can see on the left, that's a newer picture, and that just kind of helps us see, that's just a photograph, what the moving room is, right? So what we have is 3 walls and a ceiling that are suspended by ropes from within a larger room. And we take our subject who is standing on a little platform like a balance beam. And the researcher standing on the outside would be able to move that room back and forth a little bit. And our person standing on the balance beam might lose their balance a little bit. Now, in the original footage on the right, so this is a link from YouTube. And again, I hope this works well within Zoom, but if it doesn't, you can search for that video yourself. Just look for the title there, David Lee, Optic Flow of Moving Room, 1974. And what you see, I'm going to just jump ahead here. We don't need their voiceover. You can see that here a mom is taking this toddler into the moving room, and here is David Lee on the outside. And as that child turns to face the opposite wall, we're going to wait for that child to turn around. He's going to grab the room and he's going to bring that wall a couple of feet in. And we see what happens. The child immediately goes down on their bottom again and again and again and again. This is going to happen. In this case, I think he's going to move the wall away from the child. We see the child stumbles forward a little bit. And we're going to bring it back and down and go again. All right, so I think we can pause it there. It's a sufficient number of examples, right? Oh, I also have the URL. I wasn't even looking, but the URL's in the slide too, so you can get that directly if you want to watch it. So what's the take-home message here? What we've done is we have perturbed the spatiotemporal pattern in light. How did we do that? Well, we moved the walls, but how is that a perturbation of a spatiotemporal pattern in light? Well, the argument here is that this particular pattern in light is a pattern that would normally correspond to postural sway, that is, approach and retreat. Let me explain that a little bit more. If you are standing still, imagine that you're in a regular room, because in reality, rooms don't tend to sway around us, right? So you're standing in a regular room, and if you were to lean forward, your eyes would get a little closer to the wall in front of you. And because that wall gets closer, that's called approach, and it's going to expand a little in your field of view, right? And that's going to create a pattern in light that, if it's a one-to-one pattern, would then uniquely specify approach. And in particular, it should uniquely specify that you are falling forward. And your natural reaction to that would be, if I correctly perceive that I am falling forward, I should lean backwards a little bit so that I don't fall on my face. And so what we have done in this experiment, or what David Lee has done in this experiment, I should say, is he has found a way to artificially induce that pattern in the perturbation experiment. So by having the room do the moving, it induces the same kind of visual pattern that would normally correspond to a forward-leaning postural sway. And what happens when he moves the room towards the infant, the toddler, I should say, that they fall on their butt because they are not yet masters of balance. And so that throws them off balance a little bit, because their reaction is, when I see that visible pattern of that wall coming at me like this, that would specify typically that I'm falling forward, so I need to try to lean backwards. But since I'm actually not falling forward, my attempt at leaning backwards causes me to fall down on my bottom. Or on that photograph on the left with the guy standing on a balance beam, because the balance beam makes his posture a little unstable, then what happens is that once the researchers move the room in the same way, he might fall backwards off the balance beam, which reveals here that in order to stay balanced on a balance beam, that the adult is using vision to do that. And once we perturb their vision, we knock them off balance. And the toddler, who is just learning how to master their upright posture and balance, if we perturb their vision, it does the same thing. It knocks them off balance. So what it reveals is that there is, in fact, a visual spatiotemporal pattern that is used to control posture, and that perturbations of that visual spatiotemporal pattern correspond to a perturbation of perception, and that's measured by a perturbation of posture, right? Let me say that again. Perturbations of the visual spatiotemporal pattern definitely, we have demonstrated through Lee's experiment, perturb perception as measured by variations in their posture. So it shows essentially that visual pattern is used to control posture. Of course, it has to be perceived to control posture. So we might say here that this is a successful example of what we could call perception action research. We're showing that there should be a lawful one-to-one relationship between the light pattern that comes from the situation, which is the wall is approaching, and that is normally perceived as providing certain kinds of meaning to the standing person. And that meaning comes in the form of postural sway. And it directly perturbs postural sway and balance accordingly. So that means maybe all of this thinking about the retinal image as a foundation of vision is potentially problematic, and that maybe we should try to have a different foundation for vision, which is these spatiotemporal patterns in light are the real beginning point in vision, and that instead of talking so much about retinal images, what we need to do is we need to understand how the visual system working as a functional whole extracts information from the light, right? And that would really be the goal of perceptual research, is to demonstrate what those light patterns are, to demonstrate that perceivers respond to it, and then explain at the neuroscience level how eyes and brains extract that information from the light. But that research has a long ways to go, as you can imagine. But as I had noted, we will continue to talk about that particular subject once we get into the next unit, because you'll see in the syllabus that we have topics labeled ecological psychology and event perception. And it is specifically in those two lectures that are in the second unit where we're going to go into more depth and detail to provide some concrete explanation for what this is all about. But for now, we just kind of show that maybe this kind of approach could, in principle, solve the problem of constancy. That's the real goal, is to solve the problem of constancy by saying that it's no longer a problem because it's no longer a challenge to explain perceptual constancy because we don't have sensation-mediated theories. And therefore, we don't say that perception is based on ambiguous sensations. Instead, perception is based on meaningful perception. And when perception is based on information and light patterns, right? Perception is based on meaningful information and light patterns. Then and only then would we be able to solve the problem of constancy. All right, I think we are now good with that. All right, till next time.